Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Feeling Thursday King of Fighters 15 Battle Lounge. Today we are obviously playing the game you see in front of you, but the main thing we'll be discussing is character selection actually, as we have quite a few members that haven't played this game seriously in a while, and one or two that haven't ever technically played this game seriously, or King of Fighters seriously before at all. So you can expect basically beginner play in a lot of places, just old-timer experience. And in the case of the Wolf, seen on the right, basically testing out characters altogether, having quote-unquote basically never done this before. Certainly not this game seriously. The sound is down quite a lot, I believe, relative to how well I can be heard versus the game sound. If it turns out to be too light this stream, I'll adjust it for in time for the next one. But we are getting straight into it. You can probably see the ID for joining the lounge if you want to join in between. And of course this is a Atlantic Rim, more or less, lounge. If you are anywhere on the east coast of the US, the western side of Europe, the Caribbean, and so on, you can expect to have a decent connection to most people. Ah yes, my favorite stage. So one of the things we had to go for in attempting to help the Wolf select characters was understanding what exactly it is that is important to the player and how that changes as you go from game to game, more importantly. King of Fighters doesn't flow a lot like other games. Despite the fact that it is basically old school, it has never really tried to be more like other games much. There was some sign of this in King of Fighters 13, but even then they were mostly doing it their own way. And 15 has been mostly a return to roots, let's say, focused primarily on doing what King of Fighters has always done well, and staying, let's say, true to their standards. Lots of movement, not necessarily too complicated combos, and a bunch of other things I would probably spend a lot of time on streams talking about. I really love this game's design, and I can talk about it in positive ways quite a lot. Mostly in terms of the ways they chose to make it more accessible and understandable to players who don't play this sort of game a lot, and players who don't play fighting games a lot, while still keeping most of the King of Fighters to it. You'll notice that my voice is quite nasal today, which is honestly not so bad, as it's come around just in time. I'll have at least one day to recover from it before any further streams, since there will probably be no content tomorrow. So, what's important to a given player? The Wolf often needs to be able to play neutral without having to worry too much about the opponent getting to stick. King is a really good character for this because King doesn't allow people to stick to her particularly well. She has good long range when jumping, which isn't something that necessarily comes up a lot, but as an Alex player in Street Fighter, definitely the sort of thing that the Wolf can probably use naturally. Without much of the core understandings of how this game works, what you need to be successful versus not, it's still going to be an uphill struggle for a while. But it's still at least enough to get started. It's harder to understand or to come to your own conclusions about what the game is going to require when you don't even have the right characters to use. But because of the way King of Fighters works, there's a lot of stuff you can't do that you might be used to in other games, and the limitations would make you end up feeling as if your character isn't doing what they're supposed to do, even when you've got the right one. Understanding, for example, that you must rely only on your close normals, usually, or one of your crouching normals, almost always the heavy punch, to get your combos started, is a big hurdle to get over for people who are used to having, for example, simply more options in terms of which buttons they can hit. In order to make this work out, therefore, we have made sure to at least try to get some rematch level gameplay going on, and the matches are likely to speed up as people become more and more used to their characters. Even though this game can be played to down to the wire rounds for quite a long time, I wouldn't expect it to take too long to get through certain match types. As for why Ryo is a main option here, despite not having a lot of the same options that DeWolf is probably used to, is because Ryo's light buttons do a better job than many others, and in this game where there are no medium buttons, you have to get used to the idea that your lights will be a thing you have to depend on. Command normals are also very important when choosing your character. In fact, they're probably among the most important aspects of this game. But pushing forward on your opponent without understanding what exactly that's going to require can be kind of rough. So Ryo's job in this suggestion was more so to show some limitations of the game as a whole before, and build up some meter just for, being there, before moving into characters that probably suit DeWolf more. Ramon's style of movement, combined with the way Ramon's normals work, you can probably see that if you are familiar at all with the player, this works out fairly well. He's better at keeping going, he aims his strikes a little differently, not necessarily much like Nakali, for example, but we don't define DeWolf's playstyle by Nakali, partially because Nakali is intended to be a relatively simplistic character. He has a way of interacting with others that suits him, but it's not really about that per se. And of course, King placed as anchor to allow for the maximum amount of potential use of meter, potential for reversing the situation, and the highest chance of understanding how to use EX moves to get what you want out of the game. EX moves in this game are done in the standard way. You just hit both punches or both kicks and work as best you can from there. We've been talking mostly this week about accuracy in other games, and that's also one of the things you can choose very quickly. If you understand enough about the characters, or if the game shows off to you what the characters do, just try to pick whatever spots your characters normally strike at. Look for a character that does those things and pick that character. It doesn't even matter what their specials are sometimes. It usually will suit you, but you're mostly looking for the fact that when you hit heavy kick, it hits the spot on the screen you're used to hitting with your heavy kick. That's what you want most of all. King of Fighters is very neutral heavy by some standards simply because there are too few confirmed combos that really change the matchup without meter. But you can definitely see the flow here where King can fall easily into our team members' natural flow, let's say. And this case is where that's going to shine the most because Chris is a hard character to get away from, but King is able to keep Chris just far enough away that specials have to be used instead. And of course, being able to just do that style of attack from relatively far helps quite a lot. But now that they're equal in meter, it might be a little bit easier. Oh, that was good. That one is a little bit more difficult to pull off. And that pushes us into the third match. Despite the fact that these have been allowed to take fairly long today, if you are joining in, probably someone will drop to back for you because we are only streaming for 1 hour. That is our new standard. So presumably with a larger understanding of that, there may be better options for playing Ryo similar to how King was played. Ryo's a bit slower, but he does have a lot of other good options that make up for this relative lack of speed. He can play more calmly in neutral, possibly moving in neutral in a more common way. You see the forward heavy, I think that is. But even if it's not forward heavy, just understanding that the same style of option is available to what Nikali uses may help here. Similarly, his sweep has the same style of coverage, and most sweeps in King of Fighters aren't particularly punishable in the first place, so it's almost exactly the same sort of thing that Wolf is already used to from having basically the character with one of the best sweeps in Street Fighter. What Ryo is lacking, and you can actually immediately see it, a lot of characters in this game lack this, let's say, is just being able to hit heavy kick and target the middle of like your opponent's hurt box rather than trying to kick their head. And that may take a little bit more time for the Wolf to get used to. She was ready for that one. Ramon can be played in much the same way. You don't actually have to try to use Ramon's trickiness. His abilities in neutral are good enough that the only thing you're usually lacking is a way to get out of a bad situation once you're in it, and that you can use his specials for. It's a relatively heavy commitment to do this because he is going to go flying in some direction, but if your opponent is the type that tends to commit to things when you're in close with them, you can use it to counter them fairly easily anyway. He also tends to shrink his hurt boxes, let's say, compared to many other characters, making it harder for anyone to just throw out moves and hit him, because King of Fighters spends a lot of time making sure that your hurt boxes are smaller, let's say, and don't linger for quite as long. So you spend a lot more time in the game trying to get your attacks to hit perfectly. Meaning that any character that has relatively smaller hurt boxes during their movement will not get hit from as many things, simply put. It takes longer to do full damage to them. You can use your meter to get this damage, of course, but you don't really care that much all the time. This combines well with his relatively quick mobility and options for just faking the opponent out. ES version of that was quite good. So we did get the chance to go basically all the way to advantage, although this really isn't because Chris handles Ramon much better than most characters, being able to catch up fairly easily and continue to deal damage once caught up. But it's not really Ramon that we're counting on for this matchup, so here we go. That said, still balanced out by the relatively larger use of meter in the previous rounds, leaving King with less of it to mess around with. This is again a very high accuracy check style thing if your opponent tries to stay in the air. But in King's case, it's not as simple as basic accuracy, because if you do stay in the air, she can always use the Venom Strike to give the opponent something else to think about. It's a little bit hard to execute sometimes, but you can't be sure what's happening. And that will usually be enough to make people hesitate unless they're quite practiced and confident in how to strike with their character. This one I expect to be a little more explosive. Oof. Oh, well, this didn't get finished. Ramon is also easier to control space with in terms of making sure that you are exactly where you want to be after a pressure string. And that is something that does relate to Necalli, and to some extent to Bayman. But technically it applies to a lot of characters that Dwarf plays, making it a little bit easier as a whole. You can see it demonstrated there. I've hit you twice. You could counterattack, but you can't be sure that you should. This is compounded by the fact that he technically can cancel out of those moves into the same back running move, and therefore it really wouldn't matter whether or not you counterattacked or not. Technically it should be that you shouldn't counterattack with too heavy a commitment, because you might just get caught by the flying off the rope attack. Of course, you can use the standard KOF methodology of using your EX moves to punish, but you're wearing yourself out, and that's exactly what characters like Ramon want you to do. But now we've gone from King to Kukri, and Kukri's way of flowing is very different in certain ways. Kukri is basically the offensive version of the same character. While Kukri and King don't necessarily move at the same speed, and you cannot do a lot of things, you do get a lot more flexibility in where you go to start your engages. King must do most of that very actively, whereas Kukri can get away with chilling in particular spaces and then not necessarily engage at all. You can't be sure that the situation you're looking at is a positive one for you as the opponent in any way. Benimaru isn't a very good matchup here in that regard, because Benimaru can attack over his head, but at the end of the day the same thing is happening. You're still able to make the opponent focus more on defending themselves than on getting in on you and trying to navigate your movement. So even though these characters seem to be completely different from what you might expect normally, the flows they're built around can in fact match up with the player's style. Despite being more limited in general, King of Fighters characters usually have more ways they can be played that people consider valid anyway. And definitely more ways that they can be chosen to be played based on where you put them in the team. If you could be absolutely certain that a character would always start their round with meter, this can meaningfully change your advantages in the long term, simply because you know you have an EX available for a punish, your opponent can't necessarily afford to go as hard, or you could maybe just have explosive damage at some point that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Many people choose their front character as the one who needs the least meter and can play the best footsies. This isn't actually a requirement, but it is a core way to get yourself started if you don't know how to play the game all that well yet. And Rio is basically doing that job here. I don't really need the meter that much. I'm more so building it up for characters who do need it. and still managing to not necessarily result in Yashiro having too much meter, and therefore be able to defend or do big damage from this sliver of health you see. Now, better than a sliver, but still more or less 2 interactions at most. Those situations are a lot more dangerous when Yashiro has more meter, but can't afford to do that now. Even when Ramon gets hit sometimes, it's still advantageous in terms of position that comes out. So you see a lot of the same sorts of flows. And now, with lots of meter, no matter how this round goes, complex things are capable of happening. Since Ramon can get through a lot more of Benimaru's stuff, tactically this would be a better thing to aim for here. Benimaru can't take too many actions too quickly, or that will happen, for example. Because you can't really be sure whether or not Ramon is coming for you or not just because he's in motion. Forcing you to be much more offense-minded with a character who is generally relatively good at defense. Worse yet, Benimaru's even offense tends to be a little static, and Ramon might just not be in the way. Massive conversion. But EX Lightning Uppercut. But with Benimaru at a sliver, Kukri might be able to cut through now. And has a lot of meter to try all sorts of things. This is also not as easy to do because Kukri's projectile basically goes slightly higher than a lot of the characters with similar projectiles, and Benimaru players are more likely to be used to getting over those. They're also slower, so that gets even more complicated. Compounded even more here, because Antonov, while good at getting through things when ready for them, has to deal with like Kukri's aerial stuff as well. But it's still going to come down to meter on both ends at this point, which is the purpose of choosing a character in this way. You know that for whatever it is about your playstyle, you need the meter for that character to work. So, you put that character in third. It's really that simple. If you're winning, you don't have to ever play them, which kind of makes it balance itself out. Your team's a little weaker because if they were your strongest character, even only your strongest character with meter, technically, it means more likely that you're going to get pushed to using them just because you basically have to. And your opponent can therefore prepare themselves in one way or another. But another explosion there. Once again taking us into another round. Or apparently not. Maybe I miscounted. Either way, therefore, we push on. If you know these players from our other games or other streams, it's probably not so hard to understand why they play the characters they play here. But this is still partially practice. In both cases, there is at least one option for a different or better character depending on matchups. It's just that in King of Fighters, both changing your team order and swapping just one character creates a lot more variation. Because even if I say, well, you only swap one character, there are 3 characters you could swap out, leaving you with effectively 3 different teams just because you did one swap. Still, you can still see a lot of the same sorts of things here. Omni Rabbit's hitting relatively different buttons than normal for these characters. In short, Yashiro is a lot like Lara, but with the kicks and punches swapped. That would be a good way to think about it in a lot of cases. Or more so rotated all around. Yashiro hits forward light kick where Lara might hit forward heavy punch, hits standing heavy kick where Lara would hit medium punch, and so on. But that sort of thing isn't that complicated to deal with. If you really needed to do so, you could change around the buttons altogether. But overall, your goal is to make sure that when you need to hit a spot, when your opponent has gone to a place that you need to hit them from, you have a tool to hit them. That's all you care about, really. Though the Thunderclap shield is not available, yeah, there's basically all the tools here that are necessary. Benimaru vs. Isla is another sort of thing you see fairly often, with more or less a different way of playing the character style that Omni Rabbit normally plays. But with some extra options, let's say. Chris fits more into the Ibuki spot, for those familiar with Street Fighter. But it's really not the same, and it doesn't tend to matter at all. Chris is just Chris. If you needed to make some parallel, that would be the parallel to make, but if anything, it would make more sense to do the other way around. To think of the reason one plays Ibuki as being related to the reason one plays Chris. And that actually shows probably one of the most important aspects of what we were going to talk about today. It's because the game is different. Chris's job, let's say, this apparently, from what I'm being reported, is mostly on my end. Don't know why it is, but here we are. In Street Fighter 3, for example, I play Ibuki there because the thing that I need to happen in the neutral of that game is better represented by things Ibuki can do. Yep, frozen. I think someone probably lost their connection. King of Fighters is not so great at recovering from this situation as far as I've seen so far, so we might be here for a little bit. It usually won't crash the game at least, and it usually does resolve itself eventually. Today it looks like eventually might be kind of a long time though. There we are. An error occurred. I think this doesn't normally destroy the entire thing, does it? No, I see main menu and that usually implies that it has in fact dusted the entire thing. At least on my side. So, let's see if I can rejoin my own room. Sure, let's rock. Here we go. And we wait for the spectator to kick back in. I feel like there's some hosting thing involved here that I don't like the idea of, but I can't be sure yet, and I don't necessarily want to make any judgments on it. Does it think I'm on break still? The behavior of the game relative to that whole break thing has been a little suspicious to me, but for now, it wasn't really critical that I end up getting much gaming in today for this game, because I have been working on our KOF bots enough that I'm not that rusty here. And honestly, me playing my characters isn't necessarily in line with the theme of the stream, so it won't matter at all if I actually play. Which brings us back to DeWolf getting to do some more tests. In this case, the test is going to be done slightly the other way. I think this was originally supposed to be Kukri first, because Kukri doesn't demand as much meter in many situations, but King doesn't really need it either. The only main issue is that she has a lot of relative weaknesses compared to the opponent's ability to choose first character. So you can't set up as many tactical situations if she's in first slot. It does prevent you from having to deal with your opponent's metered moves and big kills, but I'm not necessarily sure that was the thing you were worried about when playing this character. That again depends on your style as a player though. If you play this character offensively, you might have different priorities altogether. But you can see that the outcome here has been mostly less meter, more time spent trying to use the meter, but not actually resulting in a victory out of that. So, it's my job basically to analyze whether or not King as point works for the wolf. Even if it was an unintentional choice, I still probably should be paying enough attention to say that with some certainty. Planning around your meter advantage and disadvantage is quite a large part of this game. It's partially as well why pro players can generally swap around point character fairly easily, and in some cases just swap their entire team if they have the same general dynamic going. As we always try to tell people, don't try to fight your opponent differently too much just because they've changed characters, unless you think they did it in order to counter you in some way. But that's still a matchup knowledge of you versus the character's abilities, more so than something you should be thinking about in terms of my opponent's going to play really differently now, or rather, they're going to think really differently now. If they've changed character to one with an entirely different style, it often represents a way of deciding to change the way they play the thing they're thinking about. I have no idea if Kukri can like fake out Isla's uppercut actually, because it does go fairly high, but not as high as you probably need it to. And once again, because it's King of Fighters, you have to think about these things. But now you get to the character from this side, from Rune Siren, that a lot of you would probably have expected. That said, that character is now one that doesn't deal well with Kukri's overhead style movement or other crazy things Kukri likes to do, because Kukri isn't trying to play neutral at any point. You can do it, it's not impossible in any way, but it's mostly just a way to pass the time until he can get back to a better situation where he doesn't have to do that. I feel like that might be more so my opinion than absolute truth, but I'm usually good enough at these things to be mostly right. If you see this and have a comment to leave as a Kukri person who is heavily invested in playing neutral, let me know how that works, particularly in this matchup, because I would not think there was any good reason to try it. And Ramon has no great reason to play neutral against Chizuru either. Crouch heavy punch to keep her out of spaces, crouch heavy kick to prevent approaches, and then fly around the place because you don't care about the rest. So in the end, the situation didn't change in the way you'd expect it to. But it also didn't play to any of the strengths of having them in this order. So there's that. I'll check on the stream later if things were too quiet. I feel like you can mostly hear what's going on, but you definitely don't hear the characters very much. Which, sound cues of characters calling out moves can be important to some people and can be stressful to others. See the level of precision required there? That Venom Strike didn't even hit. I'd say one of the bigger problems here is that even if this were a general choice to be made, like I'm playing king as point, it's not a great choice to be making when Athena is your opponent. Because she'll just like go over your stuff, go around your stuff, reflect your stuff, teleport through your stuff. I can't call this a bad matchup per se, because you have to change what you're trying to do with king quite a lot. But I certainly wouldn't play point Athena versus point king if it were up to me. I'd have to be relatively sure that my opponent was playing a very aggressive Athena before that struck me as a good idea. Because we are found in the situation where not only is Athena still winning by timeout, or apparently in the last moment due to chip damage, Duel's side ended up with 0 meter, nothing. Which of course is not entirely true in KOF. Like, for the purposes of structure, they have made it so that this always happens. You can't have your non-point character start with 0 meter, but starting with 1 meter isn't necessarily so great either. Fortunately, Athena had been worn down enough that this goes back to being pretty much normal. This isn't necessarily all that advantage for our Isla because she's still going to play Isla as if she's trying to play neutral. There are ways around this, but Kukri's ability to attack very specific spaces and move through them means that this is still going to be a struggle in particular ways regardless. And releasing the feeling to play neutral on a character where you haven't actually learned how to not do it at all yet isn't necessarily going to go great. Normally what happens in this situation is that the player takes their anchor character, dumps a lot of meter on huge damage so that they don't have to deal with whatever the bad matchup is, and fights the other fight naturally. In fact, assuming that you're not in a situation where both of the remaining characters on your opponent's side are bad matchups, that's one of the easiest ways to do it. This matchup is technically the more difficult one, so Chizuru would probably be better off using the meter here for the big damage to get Kukri out of the way, and then try to outplay Ramon by playing more aggressively. Because while Ramon has a lot of things, Ramon is not necessarily so great at punishing Chizuru for doing things. But even touching Kukri long enough to get confirms can be hard in this case, so the situation shifted around a little bit more than we would expect it to. And given the expectation of the amount of time these matches have been taking, and the fact that the game still thinks I'm on break, this is probably the last on-stream set of the night. Though I will bet that the Wolf may be continuing for some time, as one of his wishes was to learn as much as possible here in order to advance in other games. And as the Wolf has, I believe, become lounge host, this will probably go on for as long as he feels like he has stuff to learn. Now we get to see it the other way around. And against Yashiro this is pretty good, because while Yashiro can go flying over Kukri's stuff, particularly projectiles, Kukri doesn't necessarily care about using projectiles in this matchup, except at mid-range. And even then, it's not that you're trying to hit Yashiro with them, you're just trying to make Yashiro annoyed. This isn't necessarily something that comes up a lot in DeWolf's play options in any other game, but you can parallel it to just being able to hit, for example, Alex's stand medium kick. Just throw out the projectile in the same space you would do Alex's stand medium kick. For no reason, you're not really hoping that that stand medium kick is going to hit. You're hoping your opponent has to deal with the fact that they got pushback and so on. It's a similar thing here. Yashiro won't be able to do as much if your spacing is correct, and it forces a different style of gameplay altogether. Plus, it's cheap. Well, if you don't use the ES version, that is. Yashiro has lots of ways to deal with characters who just throw out projectiles as a way of defending themselves, but doesn't so much have this option when they're doing it in mid-range, and is more so likely to rely on his long range to whiff punish or punish them for doing so. Which is why you generally need to find your perfect spacing at which you can throw the projectile, assume he's going to block it, but not do anything else. And then you're just out of range of whatever punch he throws to punish you for doing so. He's a relatively whiff-punishable character because he tends to commit relatively hard to things, and that gives Ramon a large enough advantage, you could say, because Ramon can cross the screen quite quickly and deal damage in that way, particularly with the EX if needed, making Yashiro's neutral game a little bit harder. The fact that he doesn't have much armor on those things for the style of lows being done doesn't make it any easier. But now we're back to a more even match. Where everyone is depending a lot more on being hard to hit than just being able to poke at points and whiff punish. It's not really easy to whiff punish Benimaru. That said, there is one of the biggest problems for Benimaru in this matchup. Once the two end up close to each other, basically they both have the option to go for command grab. And understanding that you can do this, and which timings you will be put into a bad situation where you can't do it, can be kind of hard to track against Ramon. Like right there. You're hitting the low light punch, but yeah, you're just not making it. You could call it oppressive, but the main reason it's not is because you're not actually any threat from Ramon when this is happening most of the time. You could jump, you could get out in all sorts of ways, you could hit heavier buttons, and probably Ramon would be forced to block. But, you know, it's easier to think in terms of needing to hit something to prevent things from continuing, when that's sort of what Ramon is hoping you'll do. And that sort of thing is the thing that DeWolf reads particularly well, making it even more stressful on the other side. Big chunk of health gone, but because King is as anchor, she still has 2 more meter to go. I think that was probably not meant to be where it was. On the other hand, might just have been expecting Antonov to charge in some way. Which it wasn't that bad a bet, honestly, because she doesn't really need a lot of meter to play around in this matchup. And it more so comes down to how much meter Antonov has. He's basically going to either hurt you or not. And once he does, there's very little you can do about it. unexpected tornado kick. This game teaches you to watch your spacings in close range even more than some others, mainly because of the tendency for combos and pressure strings to not continue without specials. In anime-style games, there are more things happening before that's true. And if you're unfamiliar with the game, you might have more trouble picking out the moment at which you are the correct distance apart. This is particularly true if the opponent actually does have a button they can hit that will keep it going even though they look like they should be too far away. This doesn't come up too often in King of Fighters though. If it looks like you're too far away, or as if your opponent is too far away and you're not, you probably do in fact have the advantage you're thinking about. I think this is one of those reasons why it is such an enduring fighting game while keeping basically these same mechanics for so long. People are looking at spaces that they're in and understanding, because I'm in this space, I'm okay. But without the overloading amount of information required to play games with longer pressure strings, more buttons, and complex cancels. You can relatively easily see here, for example, that once Yashiro lands hits, Ramon is nearly never in position to do anything about them. If Yashiro can make Ramon block, Ramon's best bet is to get out of the situation, because the chances that Ramon has a move that will reach and will not lose to whatever Yashiro might choose to hit next is fairly small. Fortunately, Ramon has lots of ways to get out of these situations most of the time. But being a grappler who can't necessarily do much other than try to reach sometimes can be a little bit rough here. It's what makes Ramon a better mid character, because he's the style of character that beats the opponent's point character once they're low on health. But once your opponent's point character has too much health, especially if they didn't need to use too much meter, he can struggle a bit depending on the matchup, forcing you into this situation where your anchor might be, I'd say your anchor often tends to represent your true style, simply because you want them to be able to function whether or not they have meter. Some people just go for full explosiveness, especially if they are a footsie style player. It's easier to just get as far as you can while using the minimal meter possible, and then count on your ability to confirm into really big blasts at the end with one character that's good at doing that. But that's a little bit more counterable than playing your favorite character style in the last slot, where you actually can use some adaptation or even choose to adapt earlier on into the match by using more meter on characters if their matchups turn out to be bad, and then relying on your raw skill with your anchor character to pull through the rest of it. We're going to let the stream rock a little longer. As noted, this isn't really something that's completely strict about the ending time. And as noted, there's a lot of space in this lounge. You can join at any time, and presumably the wolf may be going for a bit longer. Not necessarily too much longer, but more likely half an hour, so you can jump in now and probably get at least one set. Tomorrow we will not be having any content, both because my voice is like this, and because even if I don't do anything relative to the local here, seems I may need more of a rest than I thought. And we don't necessarily have bots that we're confident in putting out just yet. Therefore, next content will be on Saturday, Not so sure whether or not there will be an EU stream on Saturday, but there will definitely be some Dead or Alive around the same 7:30 Eastern. And depending on how I feel, we may get Sunday content in the form of Absolver, which really has nothing to do with this style of fighting game, but is something interesting to throw out anyway, and is currently holding the space warm for DNF Duel when it releases. As for King of Fighters bots in general, still working on it, still figuring out what exactly the community considers important for them to learn that they don't get from other games. Because if you are the type of person who's much interested in our bots, you probably have enough game experience and enough experience with the bots that you're looking for something more so to help you learn to play this game with its many small, as the stream title implies, morphological differences. You can definitely see it here. Ramon can play a bit more cautiously because Yashiro is low on health. And while there was still a lot of health lost, things may turn around here because this game is heavily tactics based. The interactions don't always lead to big damage, but because there's not as much you can do to keep them going the same way, they tend to repeat. And if you're just good enough at doing the same thing enough times, yeah, you'll probably manage. That was really well spaced. Perfect decision. But again, you still see the same thing. This light kick is the light kick that DeWolf is used to. So thinking, oh, this is a spot where I should hit light kick to resolve my problem, doesn't result in something unexpected happening. Still working on slipping through all that stuff. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see much, like, perfect use of meter here. As there just isn't enough to use it on. It's better to try to play it out and leave the meter for King to get what she can out of it. After all, this is a much fairer matchup per se. While Benimaru can mostly block Venom Strike stuff, he's not so good at dealing with her slide. And while she can't necessarily use it to get started too easily, it's one of the pain points of this matchup for him anyway. And at this point, she can do exactly what we mentioned before. She can burst down Benimaru with lots of meter usage, and then try to just outplay Antonov. Always try to keep your tactics in mind for a matchup, and if you don't have any at the time you encounter the matchup or sequence of opponents, well, see what you can do anyway and work out how to fix it later. The game has a lot of characters, but the styles of characters fortunately aren't super complex. It's a relatively more simple game by some standards, and a lot of the complexity is tied up in these little decisions as to how to use your resources and how to use your characters in a given matchup. Which style is best to use for your situation. That long back jump she has really gives Antonov some trouble sometimes. Ooh, but that whiff punish. No confirm off it, but I'm not sure that would have been a good idea to try anyway. And that brings us to the end of our stream. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org under various subheadings and titles. You should be able to navigate through without much trouble. But as of now, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. I'll see you on Sunday for 60 times Dead or Alive.